Okay, I'm wearing something I don't normally wear. I got this in Ireland. It's called a triskelion. There's three little spirals that are sort of woven together, and that's a common Irish carving at Newgrange, a passage tomb. One of the coolest things in Ireland is to go into this Neolithic kind of tomb. That's amazing, and they have this triskelion, these three spirals all intertwining. And the title, title of today's talk, if we needed one, would be the spiral dance of ego, soul, and self. The spiral dance of ego, soul, and self. Ego's kicked around quite a lot, spiritual realms, and then it's sliced and diced differently in psychological realms. I want to sort of clarify it a bit, and its part in this uh, spiral dance, and then the soul, which is sort of that's a word that's gone out of fashion, at least in most psychology, unless you're a Jungian. And I really do like Jung. I had a lot of training in Jungian psychology at one point. And then the self. What did Merton mean when he talked about the true self? What's the difference between the self and the ego? So we'll try to bring a little clarity to it. We'll meditate on these terms. And I'm going to start with something you may have heard. It's a kind of Jungian parable about all this stuff, and it's called the parable of the acorn. And every once in a while, I reread it again, but it will play off of it to sort of clarify these terms because we're dealing with all of them on the spiritual path. So this is the parable of the acorn. I first encountered it in a book by Cynthia Bourgeault. Once upon a time, in a land not so far away, there was a kingdom of acorns, nestled at the foot of a grand old oak tree. Since the citizens of this kingdom were modern, fully westernized acorns, they went about their life with purposeful energy. And since they were midlife baby boomer acorns, they engaged in a lot of self-help courses. There were seminars called Getting All You Can Out of Your Shell. And who would you be without your nutty story? There were woundedness and recovery groups for acorns who had been bruised in their fall from the tree. There were spas for oiling and polishing those shells and various acornopathic therapies to enhance longevity and well-being. One day in the midst of this kingdom, there suddenly appeared a naughty little stranger, apparently dropped out of the blue by a passing bird. He was capless and dirty, making an immediate negative impression on his fellow acorns. And to make things worse, crouched beneath the mighty oak tree, he stammered out a wild tale. Pointing up at the tree, he said, "We are that." Delusional thinking, obviously, the other acorns concluded, but a few continued to engage him in conversation. So tell us, how do we become that tree? Well, he said, pointing downward, has something to do with going into the ground and cracking open the shell. Insane, they responded. Totally morbid. Why then, we wouldn't be acorns anymore. Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. I read it in one of the first books of Cynthia that I read, and then it's also in the beginning of a great book on the Enneagram. And there's a connection there. So, all right, so let's see what we can tease out of that. About the ego first. The ego would be like the shell of the acorn. The ego is basically a shell, and it comes to us. Thank goodness, with when we're born, and it's the essence of the childhood operating system, a kind of defensive shell. And again, none of these three things are things at all. Ego, um, soul, or self. They're not things like pens or computers. They are realms of consciousness. Now, the ego is a realm of consciousness that's built up of thinking, behaving, and relating. The patterns of all those three things, and those are the three. If you've done a little Enneagram work, those are the three neighborhoods of the Enneagram. That's what the Enneagram is trying to show you. The patterns of your thinking. There's the thinking guys who really are deep into thinking, the 5s, 6s, and 7s, if you know the Enneagram. There's the behaving, the patterns of behavior, which really hew to the 8, 9s, and 1s. We're 8, 9. I'm a 1. We're sort of body types. We're gut types. We're doers. Yeah, that's the first thing we get into. So thinking, patterns of thinking, patterns of behaving, and then for the 2, 3s, and 4s, patterns of relating. Everything's about relationships first for 2, 3s, and 4s. So the cluster of those patterns, because even though you might be in the body type 8, 9, and 1, doesn't mean that you don't have patterns of thought and patterns of relating. No, it's just what goes first. You see. So those are the patterns, and I want to sort of break. It's not surprising that the ego is a binary kind of thing. It has a functional. There's such thing as a functional ego and a dysfunctional ego. Functional ego, it just does that. These patterns are there to protect it, especially early in life, to protect the young child of the infant. It's for survival. Now, in an acorn on an oak tree, the shell is there to protect it as well from insects, from weather, from birds. That's the whole purpose of the shell. Okay. And that's the functional part of it. Now, whenever it gets dysfunctional is when it actually becomes the ego itself, these patterns of thought. Somehow we become convinced because they protect us. They're better than our parents in a way. They're perfect in a way because they protect us from, and we survive. And so after a while, we get a notion that that's who we are. And so when the ego becomes dysfunctional, it becomes where our self is centered. The word egocentric. Now this is dysfunctional ego. This is what the Buddha was pointing to. This is, if you want to know what Buddhism 101 is, he's saying that illusion is the source of a lot of unnecessary suffering. It's a case of mistaken identity, the Buddha would say. That's not who you are. You have an ego. You are not an ego. See, so it's tricky. And if something doesn't happen to jar us to get another view, as you go, the thing we really fear about aging, sure, at some point you fear about, well, I'm going to die someday, but really a deeper fear, at least always was for me, is that I would become like my Aunt Louise. My Aunt Louise, my mother's older sister, that shell just got harder and harder and harder as, if you don't somehow disrupt it, if you don't understand it, it will harden with age. And those are the people that you're really afraid of, the people who aren't just physically old, but those patterns are so hard. For my Aunt Louise, when we had the visitor, you're afraid to sit down anywhere, because, and then, if you moved a lamp, a quarter of an inch, she'd come in, who moved that lamp? These are people who are totally rigid. This is a total dysfunction of it. And then the egocentric, self-centered thing becomes so hard that you can do anything if it's for you, and to hell with everybody else. That's a lot of the suffering in the world now, because many people think they are their ego. and it becomes totally self-centered, separate self, and then the rest of it, well, I'm only related to you in that I can manipulate you to get me what I want. Buddhism just slices and dices it, as does Jesus. He's just not as surgical. He's poetic. Yeah, yeah. So that would be so. So we have a soul. We have an ego. We're not the ego, and yeah, we have a functional component there that really should be the thing that we, survival, how to navigate space and time. And when you grow up and can read and can write and can reason, you could be more strategic and more, you can, it's more subtle navigation of space and time. But if the ego is in the center, then it's a more strategic way of getting what you want. And that really is not in the service of the soul. So let's talk about the soul. Because and again, these are constellations in us, in our consciousness. I was talking to my son Jared about the whole pronoun thing, which sort of flummoxes people, who are of a certain age. Whenever he talks about his wife sees, he says we, and so it was confusing at first. Well, we're sort of been to that language school, but I said, well, in the beginning, I said, well, why do you call her we? He says, oh, well, there's many selves in all of us. There's not just a I. There's all these constellations of consciousness that are all sort of swirling. And so, all right, it is probably more accurate. When we say I, what do we mean? Now, the soul is one of these constellations of consciousness. I loved the last song. Bruce is my age. He's been singing for 50 years. And he says, life takes its toll, but in my soul, I'm on a roll. And that's, the body does age. Life takes its toll. There's no getting away from it unless you can do, like in the new Raiders or the new Indiana Jones thing. They got the old Harrison Ford, but after he does all the filming, they make him a young Harrison Ford for the thing. It'd be nice if you could do that. Really, maybe it would be. I don't know. They do it digitally, but time takes its toll on the body. I had somebody not too long ago, and this has happened before. They say, "How old are you?" And I said, "Well, 73." And they said, "You don't seem like you're 73." Well, but he's catching that thing. He's catching that thing, Bruce is, when he says, life takes its toll, time takes its toll, but in my soul, I'm on a roll. Because the soul is not physical, and the soul is actually growing. The soul, in the acorn thing, the soul would be the nut or the meat of it, which has the DNA of it, of a mighty oak. That's it. Our soul has the DNA, the spiritual DNA and the physical DNA, but it has the spiritual DNA of who we're meant to be, who we could be. They say, he says, we are this bigger thing, you see. And they think he's crazy, of course. Now, in human terms, on the spiritual path, if the ego misunderstood as me, and these patterns never seen, they restrict the growth. And that's why at some point, it was when my marriage was falling apart the first time and I was thrown out of the house or had to leave. I was spending most of the daytime in a bookstore, and that's where I wandered, or the shelves, and then magically, the way it works in bookstores for me, one of these little books moved down the shelf, and it was called Discovering the Enneagram. Roar. I never heard the word Enneagram. It was totally foreign to me, and I didn't know who Richard Rohr was at the time. This was early. This was the 80s, I guess, about 1980, and so I just picked it up. Flipped it. I sat when I was sitting in it was when we had bookstores that had chairs, that you could hang out all day, and that's what I was doing. So I started reading it. Oh man, started seeing the patterns. That's the first thing. Confronting the patterns of your own, the ways you behave, the ways you think, the ways you relate to people, to see those patterns. And the first thing you see with the Enneagram, which is why it seems to be like bad news to some people, is you see your compulsive patterns, how you're locked into them. I saw that right away. I shut the book and said, damn. It was like in a paragraph. It's like he told me my whole life and the creepy part of it. So, but what it shows, if you can, because the soul work at first is confronting those patterns. Oh, I'm doing it again. I mean, I never said that before I read the Enneagram. I just did it, because it was like locked in from childhood, how you do, and so once you can see the patterns, which is the Enneagram's great service to the soul, well, then you can break them. And at some point, the shell's made of these patterns of behaving and thinking and relating. That's what the shell is. It's not a physical shell. It's one of his songs. He says, "Out of the armor and into the now." Bruce was singing, "Out of the armor and into the now." As long as you're in that shell of these rigid patterns that you had from childhood, and you don't see any of them, it's like you're in a suit of armor. And furthermore, you're hooked to the past, and the future becomes an extension of the past. There's no now. And so he says, out of the armor and into the now. It's a great refrain. That's the title of the song, Into the Now. And so this is soul work. That's where the Enneagram comes in. I think it's quite valuable. It shows you the patterns. You can confront them. It's a tool. And then you can if you read it, you can't help but see, oh, I'm doing it again. And sometimes you see it before you actually do something about it. You can just halt, take a breath, don't make the phone call, don't send the email, don't let those words come out of your mouth that are going to start a fight with your wife or husband. It happens. It happens. One of my great friends once wrote on her bathroom mirror, "It's control, stupid." Because that's really the big heart of people at the top of the Enneagram. When we're out of control, oh man, we're not happy campers. We're going to do something about it. So, but when you can break that shell of those patterns, then the soul work is about expansion. Get out of that suit of armor, and you can grow a soul. Again, it's not physical, but it is about expansion. It's about growth. And then if you follow Jung's view, growth leads to expansion, leads to individuation is his term, which means you become a true individual. In other words, you have your own thoughts. I mean, I taught junior high for 20 years, and the political thoughts of the kids in my class were mostly, for most part, the political thoughts of their parents. What their parent thought. You can hear their parents talking. Well, I think this was their parents talking. But as you grow, you can have your own view, which might still be how your parents see it, but at least it'll be yours. You grow into your individual self. It's not the end of the process for because becoming an individual is one thing, but if you still feel separate, so then the final growth of it would be to become an individual and a person. Human being is one who not only realizes their own uniqueness, like, you could have a forest of oaks, but each one would be unique. But you realize you're related to all those other oaks. In the root system, you're related to the air, we're finding out how related we are to the systems. My wife went to Louisville the other day and she came home and her eyes couldn't stop watering. So we're related to the air, we're related to the smoke, we're related to the heat. He was singing about all those things. We don't just live on the planet. We are the planet. Just the way if you looked at the skin on your body with a microscope, you'd see the bacteria living there, all moving around. Well, that's us. We are the planet. We're on the skin of the planet. There's a lot of things that are below the skin of the planet, but we're on the skin of the planet. And what happens to the body happens to the skin. You see, happens to the microbes like us. So we're all connected. It's all connected, and that's what happened to Merton on that street corner. he was an individual. Boy, there's never a monk or a human being as unique as Merton. But when he had that experience, it took 17 years to emerge as a real person, a whole human being, you see. So that this is what we're talking about when he was talking about the true self. So that gets us to the third thing, the self. It's your unique whole person. That would be a mighty oak in this analogy of the parable. And to do that, it's a long road. Merton had 17 years of banging away in the monastery, writing about all these creepy parts of himself, or even discovering these orphan parts of himself as he did contemplative work, because things would come up. Things would come up. And then can you reintegrate these parts that you had to get rid of during childhood? Yes, you can do it. But it takes some kind of practice, some kind of contemplative practice. And once you integrate these parts, then you're no longer trying to, the parts of ourselves that we haven't integrated, the wounds, the orphan parts of ourselves. When somebody else walks in the room with that part, we don't like those people. How do they get away with that? This is projection. This is how it works. That when you spot somebody in a group you just can't abide, chances are they're embodying a shadow part of yourself, an orphan part of yourself. As they say in the 12 steps, if you spot it, you got it. And that's always usually a pretty good barometer. If somebody really irritates you, you can ask the question, well, what is it? What are they doing that I never could do? That's what the orphan parts of yourself are. And you got to integrate them. And then all of a sudden that person doesn't bother you anymore. They don't bother you, it just drops out. So a self, the true self that Merton talks about, is non-dual. It's not here I am and everybody else is out there and I'm manipulating them all as subject, object. No, everybody's a subject, just like he saw everybody on the street corner shining like the sun. It wasn't an individual thing. He saw everybody connected. And that's where Jung was talking about. See, so this is soul work. And really a poem I've got that I put out, people always take a copy of it. It's called The Hokey Pokey. The Hokey Pokey is inner soul work. It's in the essence of it. You make awareness the master and thinking the servant. You make now primary and time secondary. You make being your purpose and doing flows from it. Those three things again. That's what we're turning around. When you make awareness the master and thinking the servant, you make the heart, the soul, the self, the master, and then the thinking. The thinking is the ego. The ego becomes the servant of the soul, of the self. Yeah. So it's a kind of internal hokey pokey that took Merton 17 years. Might take me 17 lifetimes to accomplish. I don't care. I'm going that way. One of the other songs, when he's listing all the things wrong with the world, he says, well, when push comes to shove, it's all about love. It's a journey to love. Love is the alpha and the omega for Teilhard de Chardin, because he saw it all as a long road to evolution. And it's both the path and the goal, because he saw love as you can't make this journey intellectually. You can't make this journey to the omega point because you want to be perfect. No, it doesn't work. You make it because it's fueled by love. Somehow, at some point, love becomes in the mix. That's the force. That's what everything is. In the end, it all boils down to that. Yeah. So, okay, so that's a good segue to our silent meditation time. So I think that's enough for the talking part. Thanks for listening.